Welcome to Artwell. I'm your host, Jacob Gelly. Becoming one of the greatest jazz pianists, classical interpreters, or composers of your generation is an incredible feat. Keith Jarrett is considered all three. A prodigious talent, Keith was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1945 and began learning the piano at age 3. 2 years later, at the age of 5, he made his first TV appearance. By 7, he played a 2-hour classical solo concert in his hometown, and by 9, he performed solo at Madison Square Garden as part of a Lions Club convention. In his teens, Keith was personally invited to train in France under legendary composition teacher Nadia Boulanger, who trained many of the greatest classical musicians of the 20th century. However, he declined the invitation and instead opted to attend Berklee School of Music in Boston to learn jazz. His stint at the renowned music school was short-lived, as he was thrown out after a year, which led him to New York City. There, he scraped by until he found consistent work in the jazz world, briefly joining Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers before becoming a mainstay in Charles Lloyd's innovative quartet, and eventually playing in Miles Davis's electric band before striking out on his own. The 1970s was a busy period for Jarrett. In addition to leading 2 popular jazz bands known respectively as the American Quartet, comprised of Dewey Redman on sax, Charlie Hayden on bass, and Paul Motion on drums, and the European Quartet with Jan Garbarek on sax, Pally Danielson on bass, and John Christensen on drums, Keith also pioneered a new kind of performance, the improvised solo piano concert. Each concert was completely unique, with Jarrett composing new material for each show live and on the spot, never to repeat that music again. His 1975 Cologne concert has gone on to become both the best-selling piano record and the best-selling solo jazz album in history, with around 4 million sales. In 2025, the album was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress and selected for preservation in the National Recording Registry. With both his quartets disbanding by the end of the 70s, the 1980s became an adventurous period for Jarrett. While continuing to perform his popular solo concerts, Keith formed a new trio known as the Standards Trio, which became one of the most celebrated and longest-lasting jazz trios in history. He would record the experimental multi-track record Spirits, where he played more than a dozen instruments himself, and he would return to the classical piano world with notable interpretations of Bach, Mozart, and Shostakovich. In 1996, Jarrett was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, which resulted in him stepping away from the piano entirely. Thanks to experimental treatments, he was able to record the 1999 album The Melody at Night with You in his home studio, before returning to the stage with the Standards Trio later that year. From then on, Keith continued to perform solo, with the trio, and with orchestras until suffering 2 major strokes in 2018, the second of which left him unable to use his left hand, effectively bringing the 70-year-long career of one of the most innovative and prolific musicians this world has ever known to a close. Each one of these deep dives is connected to the one that came before. So last time out, we were talking about Robin Williams, who's considered by many to be one of, if not the greatest, improvisational comedians of all time. Keith Jarrett is considered one of, if not the greatest, improvisational pianists of all time. And Robin, whenever he was talking about his creative process, especially when it came to improv, every once in a while he would say something along the lines of this: if I could be as free and as disciplined as Keith Jarrett is, that's what I'm aiming at. At this point in time, when I was doing the research into Robin, I had never heard of Keith Jarrett before. Up until about 2 weeks ago, I knew nothing about Keith Jarrett, but this influence that he had on Robin piqued my interest enough to want to do this deep dive about him. So over the last 15 days, I have watched, read, or listened to over 50 Keith Jarrett interviews. I watched the documentary, Keith Jarrett, The Art of Improvisation, and I read the book, Keith Jarrett, The Man and His Music by Ian Carr. This episode that you're about to listen to is not a biography. It is more of an interpretation of Keith Jarrett's creative process. But if you do want more of a biography, I recommend the book Keith Jarrett, The Man and His Music. You can read it for free on the Internet Archive. That's how I accessed it. And so I'll make sure that's linked in the show notes down below, along with Keith Jarrett, The Art of Improvisation, which is available for free on YouTube. I want to remind you that if you haven't already, to subscribe to Artwell. If you're watching on YouTube, then I recommend you go and subscribe to the podcast, because I'll also be putting out an audio exclusive bonus content, which includes a ton of material that didn't make it into these deep dives. If you want to get even more out of the show, then I recommend you subscribe to the Artwell newsletter, where at the conclusion of the deep dives, I'm going to send out a summary, which includes a list of all of the lessons that we talked about doing the deep dive. And I'm also going to include some of my favorite quotes as well. You can subscribe to the Artwell newsletter now at the link in the show notes. And now, without further ado, I'm very excited to present to you my deep dive into Keith Jarrett.
Every human being, across all time and space, we've been hardwired for stories.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
Break rules.
Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
You're only given a little spark of madness. And if you lose that, you're nothing.
I think the most natural place to start with Keith Jarrett is his solo concerts, because that is what he is most known for. And like I talked about in the bio, he really pioneered, one, the solo concert, but two, the completely improvised solo concert. So like I said, he wouldn't come to the stage with prepared material. A misconception, especially when he was at his peak, that a lot of people had, was that when he said that these were improvised concerts, that meant that he had a bunch of written material and he would improvise something between each song so that the music never stopped to connect one song to the next. But what was actually happening is Keith was completely composing brand new material every single time he sat down on stage live in front of an audience. Because that in its own right is impressive. The fact that he was coming up with new material every single show, every single Keith Jarrett show was different. But in addition to the impressiveness of that feat, what's even more impressive is the fact that these improvisations that he were coming up with were incredibly complex. And so to explain it, I want to talk about this video I watched by this musician named Pierre Piscitelli. And so a lot of what I'm saying here, I learned from Pierre. And so when it comes to piano, this is going to be a very simple explanation. I should make abundantly clear that I am by no means a musician or an expert on piano. So for any talented musicians out there, I do apologize if this offends anyone in its simplicity. But when it comes to playing on the piano, how Keith would play, he would do this thing called an ostinato. And an ostinato is essentially like a continually repeated musical phrase or rhythm. So think of it like the foundation of the song or the foundation of Keith's solo. And he plays that with his left hand. So he's playing the ostinato with his left hand, which is again a continually repeated rhythm or the foundation. With his right hand, he's doing his solo. So kind of think of it, again, this is probably a very crude distillation, but think of it like his left hand is the drumming that's kind of setting the beat, and the right hand is like an insane guitar solo. And he's doing both of these two things at the same time. But not only is he doing like this crazy guitar solo, the beat he's establishing with his left hand is incredibly complex. In Pierre's video, he tries to do one of Keith's ostinatos, and he shows how hard it is to do, partially because of how far your hand has to stretch across the keys in order to do the ostinato correctly. And one of the most impressive things about Keith is the fact that no matter how complex they were, he almost never dropped the beat on his ostinato. He was incredibly consistent no matter how complex it was. And so not only was he coming onto the stage with no idea of what he was going to play until he started playing, but what he started playing was so incredibly complex that very few musicians would be able to do that. To make it even more impressive, so I mentioned how when he's doing the ostinato, his hand has to stretch really far across the keyboard. Keith had really small hands. Like one of his drummer in his standards trio, Jack DeJohnette, said that, point out the fact that he has small hands. And there was some advantages to that. He said it enables him to overlap certain chord sequences and do rhythmic things and contrapuntal lines and get these effects of like four people playing the piano when it's really just him. But I think what's really interesting is if you look at Keith Jarrett's hands, his thumb has a dexterity that isn't human. Like if you're watching a video right now, you can see my thumb, right? Keith Jarrett's thumb kind of opens all the way like this. It stretches incredibly far. And you may be thinking, well, like that's great. Like what a coincidence that this unbelievably talented musician has this natural thumb dexterity that allows him to play things other people can't. But the thing about Keith's hands is that they aren't natural. They're molded. Keith talked about in the documentary, Keith Jarrett, The Art of Improvisation, when he was a kid, he would sit in class and stretch his thumb so that it opens in that way. His hands are not naturally like that. He basically molded his hands. He created that dexterity by continually stretching his thumbs for hours at a time while he sat in class as a kid. And that shows us a couple things. Like one, from a very young age, Keith was completely committed and he understood that this was his calling. He was going to be a piano player. But I think it just demonstrates the level of commitment that he had to that pursuit. That he was willing to sit for hours and stretch his hands, that they were able to move in a way that is almost inhuman. And when he was playing the piano on stage during the solo concerts, he describes it almost as a channeling. Like when you really get going, you're not thinking about what you're playing. It's just something is coming through you. To quote him, he says, I'm not in a position to describe in words where it comes from. I've been letting it happen all by itself so much that I'm looking at it as something completely independent of me, which it really is. I'm just transmitting it. And this idea, especially for live performance, is not something unique to Keith. To tie it back to Robin Williams once again, Robin had a very similar idea. He said when you're creating, and this is specifically when it applies to improv, when you're creating, you just become a vehicle. It seems to come from a divine source, a sense of wonder of God. And this, really what I think both of these guys are describing is flow. Like when you're in flow, you're not thinking, like things are just happening. And so part of Keith's process to do these live performances was he described it as emptying himself and start with nothing. No music. He didn't want to have a mood. He didn't want to be happy or sad because I would influence it. He wanted to start with nothing. He wanted to just going to be this vessel to empty himself out so that's how he could be flowed through essentially. And that is what he's aiming to do. He's trying to get into this state of flow. And to quote Vinny Colaiuta, who's a modern drummer and classic drummer Hall of Famer, and he said this in an interview with Rick Beato, he said, thought is the enemy of flow. And so that feeling of channeling is the fact that you're not thinking. That is what they're describing, is a lack of thought. And you're acting basically off of instinct. And I think that this offers us a really interesting insight into the idea of flow. Because when Keith sits down at the piano, what he says is, I put my hand somewhere and play something fast before my brain starts telling me what it's going to do. So when he gets down at the piano, he tries to play it in such a way that he doesn't think about what he's going to play. He just starts. And I think that's an interesting insight into flow because flow follows action. It does not follow thought. And I think that's just an important lesson for creatives, is we so often, at least I do, feel this need to think of the best way to do something. And oftentimes to get into flow, like I just finished writing an essay this morning and I had a really difficult time with this essay because I was overthinking it to like the nth degree. And I would just stare at the blinking cursor because I was like, the words have to be perfect. I need this has to say this and this has to say that. And it took me far longer than it should have. The essay itself is 2,000 words with about 600 words worth of quotes. And I think the writing of it took me like 3 weeks. I probably could have done it in 2 days. But because I was overthinking it, I was never able to reach a state of flow. Like I just needed to start typing, to start putting words on the page and just let it kind of fall out of me, to be channeled. But you're never going to be able to access that if you're overthinking. And flow is essentially you're operating entirely off of instinct. And thinking through thoroughly and instinctual action are two very diametrically opposed ways of operating. And so for Keith, his biggest objective when playing the solo concerts was to come in with no thought, with nothing, so that he could open himself up to flow, to being channeled. And I think what's interesting about the world we live in today is it is, I would argue, becoming harder and harder to enter into flow because of the amount of distractions that exist today. Flow is the absence of thought, and there's always something to do to stimulate your brain. Like you can I think that there's always a stat. It's like it takes 23 minutes to fall into flow or 23 minutes to fall into deep work after a distraction. And it's so quick and easy to check your phone. Or even if you're working, and you have your email notifications popping up, like that takes you out of it. And so I think flow is where a lot of the magic happens, where you're operating off of instinct. But it's so hard to get there, and it's going to be increasingly hard to get there in today's world. And so you need to create an environment in which that is possible. And we're going to talk about how Keith created that environment at his concerts in a little bit. But first we have to talk about risk and death. Because when Keith is doing these solo concerts, it's an incredibly risky thing to do, to walk out on stage in front of thousands of people with no idea what you're going to play, no idea if it's going to work, if it's going to fail. He didn't have written material. Robin Williams, when Robin would go and do his improv, he wouldn't improv an entire show. He would have written material that he could fall back on if the improv wasn't going well. Like, he had the stuff that he worked, that he kept in his back pocket, that if he needed, he could pull it out at any time. Keith didn't have that. Keith walked out on stage every single time at 0. And there's a lot of risk required to do that when your entire career is riding on the fact of you doing something brand new relative every single time you perform. His manager at the time, Brian Carr, or in the 70s, I should say, said it's quite an ordeal Keith goes through to do these solo concerts. There's always the possibility in some people's minds that this just might be the night he can't play, the night he remains blank. I think that possibility seems just as real to him as everyone else. And it was very real to Keith. There's a quote in his biography that says, I think perhaps I'm more fanatical than most because I have more to lose by not succeeding. This is after he achieved a level of fame. So probably like after the Cone concert, we'll say, Facing You comes out, he's got his 2 trios, like there's success happening now. So this risk that he's doing becomes greater the more success he has. So he says, I think I'm more fanatical than most people because I have more to lose by not succeeding. No matter what I do, it will probably get written up. Whereas in a debut of someone in New York, no one's going to get all upset if he had a bad concert. If I have a bad concert, it's known all over the world. And one time when I was reading, I think this was in the Rolling Stone in 1979, was where this article is from. But Keith is talking about how death hovers over his solo concerts. When I first read that, I was like, okay, that feels kind of pretentious. But then when I was digging into it and like putting together the outline for this episode, it was actually one of the biggest unlocks I had over the course of this research process. Because when Keith is talking about death at his concerts, I don't think he's necessarily talking about like literal death, like somebody dying. I think more so what he's referring to is like career death, right? Like how his manager talked about, maybe there's going to be a day where the music just doesn't come to him. His entire career is built off of him being able to do that, of him being able to walk out on stage and play something brand new every single night. It's like this magic trick you expect him to at some point not be able to pull off, but he just keeps pulling it off. And so his career is built upon this foundation. So if he's not able to do that, it's kind of like a death of his career, essentially, how to think about it. So really what death is in this context is failure. Death hovers over the concert because like failure is hovering over the concert. And should he fail to do what he is setting out to do, that is the metaphorical death of his career. And so the failure is where the risk comes from in the live performances. And Keith at one point said, I see risk as a life force. But I think if we reappropriate that quote, it's actually like to this death metaphor, death is a life force. So for Keith, it's the fact that there's the possibility of him dying, his career dying, that gives him a level of awareness and focus when he's doing his solo performances that he would not be able to achieve otherwise. Like, to put it in his words, he said, death hovering anywhere in a way enhances the potential of that experience. Mountain climbers, for example, they could fall off the mountain and they keep wanting to go back there. And the best you can get as an answer is, why do you do this? And it's because the mountain's there. But essentially what they notice, I think, is how enhanced all their senses are by the possibility of making a wrong move. And at a solo concert, since there's no subject, pianists who've never done it would be as scared as those mountain climbers. And oftentimes people think because I did, let's say, 400 of those concerts, that I'm not scared anymore. But if I wasn't scared in that particular positive way, I wouldn't have any reason to do it. And so death is a life force for Keith Jarrett, or risk is a life force, as he put it, because it enhances his abilities as a piano player. It makes him care, you could say, in a way that nothing else does. And so that is part of the risk, is the scary thing of what he's doing, but the risk is also the reason that he's doing it. And because he was doing it, because his senses were enhanced and his abilities were enhanced, he was able to perform in a way he wouldn't have otherwise. And I think the challenging thing as an artist is when you're on the come up, risk is inherent. Versus when you start to have success, risk becomes less and less obvious. And like the opposite of risk is comfort. And an artistic mind does not thrive in comfort. And what is comfort when I say that? In the artistic sense, is what is known. which is essentially like, and what is known is what you know you're good at and what the audience comes to expect from you. And so the advantage of the solo concerts that Keith is doing is two things. One is the audience never fully knows what to expect. Like I'm sure, and to his last quote, he says if he was, I guess, comfortable in those live concerts, he wouldn't be able to do them anymore. There wouldn't be a reason to do it. But I think too, the live concerts are able to evolve with Keith's style. Like as you listen to his music throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, into the 2000s, like his style does change as he starts to take on classical work. Like that starts to influence his solo piano in a way. And so it's able to evolve with him. But comfort as an artist is when you keep going back to the same thing because you know it works and know the audience wants it. And Keith's perspective on it is that everything that helps you to stabilize yourself. So like, stabilizing yourself in terms of financial situation, like you know what to expect from the audience, like there's a level of stability there. Everything that helps you to stabilize yourself anchors you in this dance, keeps you from flowing, which we talked about. Flow is the core thing that he needs in order to do these solo performances. And you can say the risk helps him get into that flow state because it becomes the only thing he can focus on is not dying, right? Like when you're on the side of a mountain and your one hand slips and your next move is vital, you're not thinking about the awkward thing you said at the dinner party 3 days ago. All you're focused on is the fact that you're dangling by your fingertips off the side of a mountain and your next move is everything to you. And so that's what happens to Keith when he's doing these solo performances, is the risk forces a level of flow. And so he says that when you start to go back to the things that you're comfortable with, things you know how to do, it keeps you from flowing. And the danger of that is crystallizing, like wanting to make a liquid into a solid so that you know where it is and it won't go into the next room. I think that quote's really interesting if we unpack that for a minute. I'm going to say it one more time. Wanting to make a liquid into a solid so that you know where it is and it won't go into the next room. Because the next room, you don't know what's in there. Right? If you take that risk as an artist to try and do something you've never done before, you don't actually know what's on the other side of that door. So if you make the thing, your artistic ability, your creative process, if you make it a solid, it sits here, you know where it is, you know what it is, you know how to find it, you know how to do it. But that prevents you from flowing. So the danger of that is it's crystallizing, like wanting to make a liquid into a solid so that you know where it is and it won't go into the next room. You solidify, you take it with you and you put it down on the table. Everyone crystallizes, but the earlier you do it, the less you are alive, And as soon as you're crystallized, it's not life anymore. It's an attitude toward life. You're not living. You're putting your one stake down. Instead of your 2 feet on the razor, you have a third thing, your attitude toward that. Your attitude toward what's around the edge and how to deal with it. You decide how to deal with life. So when you crystallize as an artist, you are saying, this is how I make things. This is what I do. But that becomes boring. That becomes comfortable and there's less creativity there. And again, as you become more and more successful, as you quote unquote make it, there's less natural danger. So it's harder to put yourself in riskier situations because you have to put yourself in that situation. But when you're doing that, once you've made it, quote unquote, there's more to lose now. Versus if you're like the starving artist, you're kind of at the bottom. And so what you're risking is much less valuable than once you've made it. You're risking money, fame, status to go out there and do your art. So it's much easier to become more comfortable because you have so much more to lose. But the imperative of the artist is to push the culture forward. And you're not going to push the culture forward by remaining in what is comfortable for you and for the culture. You have to go beyond that, right? Like life exists at the edge of your comfort zone, but that exists for artists as well. You have to consistently do that because comfort kills creativity. To quote Keith again, it's being insecure that seems to quash everyone's actual creative attempts, because there's nothing but attempts out of a security, out of your comfort zone, is what these creative attempts are. In order to do this, I have to jump over there, and I won't be here anymore if I jump over there. You won't be where you're comfortable if you take a risk and jump outside of it. And if I'm used to being here where it's comfortable, I'm not going to jump over there unless I had an experience once of jumping and waking up, which is essentially like I won't take the risk if I know it's going to work. And truthfully, I think if you take a risk and you know that it's going to work, that's not really the risk. Then Keith, to finish off the quote, says, then I'll know that even if I die when I jump over there, it'll be worth the jump because I could have just died sitting over here. And I think that last line is really important. Staying in your comfort zone, right? Doing the thing you know that you do, doing the thing the audience knows you do, that the audience expects from you. While it prevents your quote unquote death in the short term, it's actually just a much slower, arguably more painful, quote unquote, metaphorical death. In the sense that if you're a band and you try something new that you feel compelled to do, right? The secret here is that when you make these changes, when you try to push out of your comfort zone, you're not doing it just for the sake of change. You're doing it because you have something you want to express and you're following that desire. So when you can do that and it doesn't go well, it's going to hurt, and it's going to hurt hard. It's going to hurt fast. Versus if you're a band and you're like, we want to do this thing, but like we have this bunch of hits that everyone knows us for. So we're just going to keep playing those hits for 20 years. Like that kills your creativity. Comfort kills your creativity. And so the death in that is much slower. It feels more comfortable in the moment, but over time, it's less fulfilling to you as an artist. And so that's what Keith is saying here is like, you could make the jump and die, or you could stay where you are and you're going to die there as well. So what's the point in staying there where you don't want to stay if you're going to die sitting there too? You might as well take the jump because, yeah, you could die, but you could make it. And if you make it, everything just becomes that much better. The way he describes it is you want to dance on the edge. And I think what he's saying is you want to go to the edge of what is known and unknown. And to him, that is the secret to not crystallizing, to not staying in your comfort zone. He says, I think you have to be completely without mercy with yourself. You can't say something like, I did this yesterday before I played the concert, and the concert was great. Therefore, I should do that again. Anything that creates a pattern creates an anchor. First, it's conscious, and then it's unconscious. And when it's unconscious, it isn't only an anchor, it's a habit. And so when you're doing something because you know it works, that's a negative thing is what he's saying, because it creates an anchor. It prevents you from moving, from growing as an artist because you're stuck to that anchor. You have to let go of those things in order to move forward as an artist. But that's a scary thing to do, right? Because when he says dance on the ragers or dancing on the edge, I think we say like dancing on the edge of what is known and unknown. That's a scary thing to do, right? Both known to you, but I also think known to the audience, because the role of an artist is you have to push the culture forward. And you're only going to be able to push the culture forward if you give the culture something new, because you're not pushing the culture forward if you give something it already has. You're just moving it sideways. And so in order to do that, you have to go to this edge of what is known and unknown and find a way to give people something that they don't even know they want yet, which is scary, right? Like it's much easier to be like, the audience wants this, I'm going to give them this. The audience doesn't want that, I'm not going to give them that. Or actually, not even that. It's the audience wants this, I'm going to give them this. I don't know if the audience wants this or not. I'm just not going to give them that. I'll give them the thing that I know they want. But again, that works in the moment, but over time, it's a slower death because the audience wants what they want until they don't want it anymore. And if you're only good at giving them what they want right now, you're going to be in a tough situation when they change what it is that they want. And in that case, you can try to give them something new that you want to give them, or you can just kind of chase the audience around, which is not fulfilling to you as an artist. So you have to go to this razor's edge and find a way to give the audience something new that they don't even know they want yet. And as scary as that is, he says, my experience has been that when you risk losing a listener by doing something new, right? Like doing something they don't even know they want yet, you're either doing something terrible or something very important. And I would argue that if you're doing it, if you're risking losing a listener because you're trying something new that you deem important, that you want to do, then I would say that that's something very important. But the thing about the edge, especially once you start to have success, is that the edge does not come to you. You have to go to the edge. You have to intentionally take these things, that this comfort you've developed, and put it on the line. You have to make that decision. This is a lesson that Keith learned from Miles Davis. And Miles was telling Keith, you know why I don't play ballads anymore when I perform? And Keith was like, why? And Miles was like, because I like to play ballads so much. And that is the reason he doesn't, because that would restrict him as an artist. If you only do what you love to do and what you're comfortable doing, that is going to stagnate your growth as an artist, which is going to stagnate the culture. And so you have to go out, you have to put yourself out on that razor's edge. And of course, it's scary, right? Because you could fail. And I think could is actually a lie. I think you will fail. If you're going out there and doing something like that, like not everything is going to hit. Like failure is inevitable when you're dancing on the edge. But Keith says that like the truly valuable artist is the artist who realizes the impossibility of his task and then continues to do it anyway. I'm going to say that one more time. The valuable artist is an artist who realizes the impossibility of their task and then continues to do it anyway. It makes me think of Simon Sinek's The Impossible or The Infinite Game. The infinite game is essentially this game theory that says that any game, which is any pursuit in life worth pursuing, is a pursuit that you'll never actually achieve. Because you can, in theory, work on it for your entire life and never get there, which allows you to always be working towards it. Versus if you pick these like finite goals of like, we need to make this much money. Once you make that much money, then what? Right? Like you see this so often with people. It's like, I need to make enough money to buy, I just won't need a Lambo. When I have a Lambo, I'm going to be successful. Like the hedonic treadmill is never ending. So by playing these like finite games, you're putting yourself into a different kind of infinite game, which is this hedonic treadmill that never ends. And you'll never truly be happy because you're putting your happiness in the outcome. Versus if you put your happiness in the playing of the game itself, it allows you to play the game forever and continue to be happy that you're playing the game. You're not making art for the outcomes. You're making art for the art itself. I think it's only those people who are making the art for the art itself that are able to realize and understand the impossibility of what it is they're trying to do and continue to do it. Because the impossibility of your task oftentimes is not the thing that's going to make you the most money. Right? Like I think your full potential, I think, isn't the version of you that like becomes the most famous or becomes the richest. It might be the version of you that makes the greatest impact. And maybe there's a chance that the version of you that makes the greatest impact also becomes the one that makes the most money, but not necessarily. Like for a lot of you, you could probably make more money with like drop shipping if you got really, really good at it than being an artist. But that's not fun for you. Wouldn't be fun for me. I remember I tried to drop ship for like 3 days. I signed up for this like platform called Oberlo, which is like a drop shipping platform. I was like, this is the way. And then I realized, oh, I actually hate this. Like I wouldn't want to make money that way. And I think there's like a level of romanticism you have to balance here of like, I think the notion of a starving artist is silly to a degree, but you also don't want to make money that you fully hate. And so I think that to bring it back to Keith's point here of understanding the impossibility of your task and doing it anyways, I think that's only available to people who are making the art for the art itself. And part of the impossibility of that task is giving people something new they don't even know they want yet, which is what you're pursuing when you're out on the edge. But I think that don't necessarily view failure as a bad thing. I think for Keith, we talked about a little bit here how risk the failure there. But I think when you're making art, I don't want the takeaway here to be that you have to avoid failure at all costs. Because I think if that's the takeaway, that leads you to a place of operating out of comfort. Failure is important because it allows you to find I'm referencing a Robin Williams quote here where he says, you have to fail in order to find the new. And essentially, using Robin Williams as the example here, is that when Robin would do stand-up, he is known as this like great improvisational comedian. I mentioned earlier how he had all of this like material in his back pocket that he could reference whenever he needed to, right? Like if the improv wasn't going well, he could just fall back on what worked. And this is his improv is viewed as like his greatest strength. But if you ask Robin, and when he's really like digging into the weeds of his creative process, he would actually say his improv is almost his greatest weakness as a comedian, which I think is interesting. There's this idea that your greatest strength is the flip side of the coin of your greatest weakness. And Robin is kind of like explaining this without realizing that's what he's explaining. a lot of people view his improvisation, his quick wit, his speed, being able to go to like joke is incredible. But there's this like Newsweek quote from 1986 that basically says like Robin Williams, the reason you go to see Robin Williams perform isn't necessarily for the jokes, it's for the spectacle of Robin Williams. Like there's probably not many Robin Williams one-liners that you can name because of his approach to performing, his like speed and improv and just quick wit. Like it's just, there's so much going on that like you're almost like inundated with Robin Williams hilarity. And Robin is essentially what it's saying is like with Robin Williams, you don't get the big laugh. You just get a repeated, consistent laugh. It's a bit of a different experience. And Robin acknowledges this. He's like, look, I think that the way in which I perform actually holds me back as a comedian. Because I'm not looking for the biggest laugh. He's just looking for the consistent laugh. And so because of that, he'll find material that gets that laugh, that's good enough, and he'll kind of sell for it because he's going to go through so much so quickly. Versus if he wanted to get to the big laugh, he would have to take the risk of changing the material that's quote unquote good enough, failing a few times with those changes, but using the feedback from that failure to eventually get to a point where he has the joke that gets the big laugh. And that's the scary thing you have to do as an artist, is you have to fail to find the new, because failure is a data point. It's feedback that allows you to iterate and improve until you get to the point where people respond positively to, where you get that big laugh. And that is why you have to fail in order to find the new. There's a quote, I probably referenced it in the last 3 straight of these deep dives, George Miller, Robin Williams, and now with Keith Jarrett. And it's this combination of Tom Hardy quotes. Tom Hardy is an actor. He was Mad Max in Mad Max Fury Road, which is why he came up in the George Miller season, the director of Mad Max. The precipice is on the edge of making a mistake, which is interesting, right? Like that is not a different interpretation, but a different lens of looking at what dancing on the edge means, right? Like I'm talking about it. What I think Keith is saying is that it's dancing on the edge of like what the audience wants for sure and what you're not sure the audience wants next, which is what Tom is saying here, is dancing on the edge of making a mistake, because it's really easy to make a mistake trying to give the audience something new that they don't know they want yet. Versus you could just do the easy thing and give the audience exactly what they want. And so you're like dancing on this edge, and there's very easy to make a mistake in that situation. So that's Tom's interpretation of the edge. So the precipice is on the edge of making a mistake. So when you fall and fail and fuck up, you pick yourself up and move forward, having learned something new. You know what it isn't. I think that's the important line when it relates back to Robin Williams' fail to find the new. So when Robin has this bit that kind of works, and it could be better, he has to make changes to what he knows works. Like he has to make changes to a good joke to get it to a great joke. But the problem is he doesn't actually know what it's going to take to get it from a good joke to a great one. So he makes a change to see if it works. And if it doesn't work, well, it's a failure. But that failure teaches him that, okay, this isn't the angle to go with. Try option B. And then if that one doesn't work, okay, now you know option A and B don't work. Try option C and see if that version of the joke works. And so you have to make these failures to get that feedback in order to correct your course to find the great version of that joke. So returning back to the Tom Hardy quote, you don't know what's going to work and what isn't. So you have to be brave. If you're not failing, you're not fucking doing the job properly. I'm going to say that one more time. If you're not failing, you're not fucking doing the job properly. Now, if we relate that back to the Keith Jarrett quote of the artists who realize the impossibility of their task and continue to do it, the impossibility of the task of the artist is to continually fail in public and keep going. That is a near impossible ask to give someone. But the artists who are truly valuable in Keith's lens are the ones who are able to do that. The ones who are able to consistently fail and put themselves out there over and over and over again and keep going. Because according to Tom, otherwise, you're not doing the job properly. I just want to quickly circle back to death to keep things cheery. Because I think there's another interpretation of death in the artistic sense that's not like you might fail, which is a version of death or like career death, but more in like a literal sense of nothing lasts forever and things do come to an end. Like Keith talked about this. He said that I think there's a life expectancy for everything, which means that unless it's completely synthetic, it's got to die sometime. And that's a healthy thing. I mean, it's part of health. You couldn't be healthy if you weren't alive, and you can't be alive without dying. And I think that that is interesting. Like everything is going to end at some point, whether you want to admit it or not. And I think the acknowledgement of that fact can spur you on to do your best work. Like advice Keith always gave his students was play like you think it's going to be the last time. That's the only way to play. And that's a difficult thing to do. Like it's hard to put yourself in that mind frame. And he says, as you continue to go through your career, you become able to access that feeling more and more because you get closer and closer and closer to what is actually going to be the last time you play. But if you can put yourself in that mind frame earlier, I think it has the potential to allow you to do greater work. Because I think this gets lost a little bit in a modern context where there's just an overwhelm of content. Like there's people posting, like Alex Hormozy, I think posts like hundreds of times a week. And if you're a creator, maybe posting every single time, every single day, like once a day. I think that like devalues your relationship to what it is that you're making. And I think rightfully so. Like I don't think you should be putting the same level of care into, let's say, a music album or into a film that you do into a 30-second TikTok. I don't think you should put the same amount of effort in. But I think that the habit of us spending so much time making content to promote the thing, whether it be a film or music, like we're building this like weird muscle, like this detachment from the things that we're making because we just have to get it out there. Because there's going to be we're going to continue doing it tomorrow. Like there's so much content we're going to put out there, like this specific one doesn't matter. But I think that can start tracking to everything that you're making. But I think if you can find it within yourself to make the acknowledgement of like, you have to treat this thing like it's going to be the last time. And that's a hard thing to do. And so I think there's like a reframe you can do with it which connects back to the point of time where we're posting all the time and it's like desensitizing us to this because we're putting so much into the world. But like, if you're making music, you might only release over the course of your career, like 15 albums, we'll say. Keith Jarrett's a little bit different. He has over 100 albums, and we're going to talk about his prolificness in a little while. But you might only put out 15 albums. Or another example of this, when I did a deep dive on the God of War video game franchise, which is it's a video game franchise that for 20 years has consistently released some of the best made games on each platform it came out on. And when I look at God of War, over the course of 20 years, they've made, not including like games outsourced to other studios, 6 games. So you don't actually get that many at-bats. And when it comes to video games, like the time frame it takes to make a game now is getting longer and longer and longer. And so, well, yes, like you have your whole life ahead of you, the total number of times you're actually going to release something of genuine significance is less and less and less. Like you don't actually get that many at-bats to make a movie. Right? Like Steven Spielberg's prolific. He's made 40 movies or something like that. Really, like 40 movies is a lot, but it's also not. 15 albums is not really that many. And so, well, it's hard to put yourself in this position of like, treat this like the last time you're ever going to make something. Treat this like the last time you're ever going to play or the last time you're ever going to make a movie. When you're 29, that's hard to do. But it's different when you can like, I'm not actually going to get the opportunity to do this thing that many times over the course of my life. So I might as well make the absolute most of this opportunity. If you want to look at it even another way, this is the one and only time you're going to be 29 making a movie. Like you're never, ever coming back here. You're never going to get the chance to make this thing at this point in time when your brain is this way with these people. So make the most of it. Let the acknowledgement of the fact that this is all going to end in some way, shape, or form, whether it be your literal death, whether it be your career ending, whether it be just this one project you're working on, it will come to an end and you're never going to get to do it again. Like using Taylor Swift as the example, right? Like Taylor Swift is re-releasing all of her music. And there's this constant debate of the fact of like, which one's better, the original or Taylor's version? Taylor's version is like, from my understanding, the exact same people in the studio making the exact same music again, but yet it comes out sounding different. Rightfully so, because the people are changed and things have changed. And so use the fact that whenever you have the opportunity to actually make something, to give it the respect it deserves, to try your best to make something great. Because it's all going to go away, whether it's this specific project, whether it's career, whether it's life, right? Like death is a life force. Like the reason all of this matters is because it's all going to end at some point. And it's going to end a lot sooner than any of us want to admit or acknowledge. And so make the most of your opportunity, whatever that opportunity is. And I don't want this to be a downer, right? Like I think that yes, all of this is going to end and that's very sad, but also the flip side of it is like, that's why all of this matters. I think it's amazing. And so again, make the most of it. Make the most of your opportunity what you have now, because it could go away at any point in time, whether it be death, whether it be some form of failure that takes opportunities away from you. You know, to quote Keith again, which I think this quote is like a really good summation of everything we've talked about up to this point. You're never in a secure position. You're never at a point where you have it all sewn up. You have to choose to be secure like a stone or insecure, but able to flow. And insecurity, like we talked about, creates that flow because you have to concentrate so much on the task at hand to the point where you don't think about anything else. And when you have no other thoughts and you're operating on instinct, that is what allows you to get into flow. But I think saying secure like a stone is actually a fallacy. Because security itself doesn't actually exist. There's just the illusion of security. Because like we talked about, you might feel secure in the moment, but it's just a slower decline, a slower failure when you choose comfort, when you choose security versus insecurity. And like you talked about, everybody's going to seek a level of crystallization at some point. They are going to become more solidified in what they do. But you have the choice to not do that. You can push that off as long as you can. And so insecurity, while there is a chance of failure, also, again, there's a much greater upside. But when it comes to security, like no matter what, time is passing. And eventually that will erode the security that you have. So security is a bit of a fallacy. And so when you chase insecurity, when you take risks, when you take chances, it forces you into a state of flow because that's the only thing you can focus on. And it is that focus that makes you great. That focus that allows you to get into flow. Because when you do that, you need like a certain level of concentration to be into flow, right? Flow is the absence of thought. So you can't be thinking about like 10 different things at the same time. You have to just be thinking about the task, or not even thinking about the task at hand, but just doing the task at hand. And so if we bring it back to the solo concerts, which kicked this whole thing off, you can imagine the level of concentration required to do that, to sit in flow like Keith does. The performances are about an hour and a half-ish, usually 2 45-minute taps. So to be in flow like that with an audience with such extreme stakes, like requires an immense level of concentration. But I think the truth about flow is it's fragile. It is incredibly easy to break it, to come out of flow. And I talked about just the distractions we have today, but that is why you have to kind of create this environment and guard that place with such ferocity, because flow is so important, but it's so easy to break. And so Keith has this reputation, which is granted, warranted, of being incredibly demanding of his audiences, to the point where he's rude to his audience. Like he has stopped performances, berated audience members for coughing, for eating. If you go online, I think it's Umbria Festival 2013, there's a video of Keith coming out on stage and basically saying like, hey, put the cameras away. If I hear one more camera click, we reserve the right to like not perform for you. And obviously, like from the outside perspective, and again, I think this is warranted and rightfully so, like you kind of be like, yo, what are you, I'm paying to watch you perform. Like, what do you mean if I cough, you're not going to perform? But I think that with everything we've talked about, putting that into context, like this behavior, I think the reason Keith is so aggressive towards his audience is because it breaks his flow, because flow is fragile. And the experience that you are paying for from Keith isn't just him playing the music. It's him getting into flow. That is what you're there for. You're there to see, similar-ish to Robin Williams. Like, yes, Keith makes beautiful music, and I'm not denying that. But similar to Robin Williams, where you're watching him for the spectacle that is Robin Williams, that's kind of also what you're paying for with Keith. Like, you're paying for the spectacle that is Keith Jarrett, to watch him do the magic trick again, to do the high wire act. Again, this thing you don't think he's going to be able to pull off, and yet he finds a way to pull it off again. That's what you're paying for. And he's not going to be able to deliver that experience to every other person in the audience if one person is coughing. And the coughing is interesting. Like, he's done things at his shows. And again, I think the reputation that he has is warranted. I'm not fully defending his actions. I'm more so explaining them. Like, there's stories of him like leading the audience through a group cough before a performance so everybody gets it out. He's handed out like cough drops to everyone in the crowd so they don't cough. But then that leads to issues where people are like crinkling. I have cough drops right here. People are crinkling their cough drop paper, and then he would stop performances for that. And what he says his real frustration with his behavior is, like, if somebody genuinely coughs, he's not going to stop the show. Like, that's part of the flow. That's just part of the reactive to the experience. But his issue is when people cough out of like the inability to sit still for 45 minutes, or they're crinkling their paper because they can't sit still for 45 minutes. But all of it to say, I think the root of it is the fact that it breaks the flow, and the flow is the experience that people are paying for. And so he's got this reputation of being very demanding of his audiences. And he also has this reputation of being very demanding of the venues that he performs at, him and his bands perform at, especially the jazz trio, or the standards trio, I should say. And they have this very long rider that they send to every venue that they perform at. And he says it's funny where they have this really long rider, which is again where the demand and reputation comes from. And everyone complains about the fact that, like, oh my goodness, like, there's so much in these riders that we have to like think about and take care of before the show starts, versus like all these other bands that come through, they have like small little riders and they're super easy to deal with. And Keith goes, but like the acknowledgement that they never make is like, when we go onto stage, like, it's super easy. Like, there's no last minute stuff because it's all in the rider, versus when you have these other bands come through, it becomes incredibly stressful at the last minute because of all the things they didn't put in the rider because they didn't want to come across as demanding. And so the demanding reputation that he has with venues is like this warranted reputation, like warranted in his demands, because he's not asking for no brown M&Ms, which is this famous story of the band Van Halen, famously in their rider had something in there that says, we want a bowl of M&Ms, but with no brown M&Ms in the bowl. And that gets misconstrued again of like, look at how demanding this band is. But actually what it was like them making sure that the riders were thoroughly read by every venue. But Keith didn't have anything like that in their rider. Everything they were asking for was to make sure that the environment with which they were performing was as great as it could be so that they could deliver the performance that the audience expected. Like, that's what all their demands were. That's what Keith was demanding of the audience. That's what he's demanding of the venue. He's not doing it out of a level of pretension. Now, to be fair, it takes with a grain of salt. I've never read his rider, but he wasn't doing it. He was demanding of the audience and demanding of the venue for the sake of the performance, for the sake of the art, not for the sake of himself. And part of the reputation he says too that he gets, especially from the venue side, is so many jazz musicians never asked anything. Like, there's this expectation that from promoters that jazz musicians just need the money, so they'll take whatever they can get. And so we're just like, who cares? But so here's Keith's full quote on it. Promoters think jazz musicians need to play once they're there because they can't afford not to, because that's the whole surrounding ambience of jazz. And so when a jazz group comes and says, we aren't playing, they think it means that they're just temperamental artists. People ask me why pianos are so bad and say how lucky I am to be getting good pianos. It's not luck. It's that why do I have the reputation for being so difficult? It's not even difficult. It's just the norm is to accept anything. If there were enough musicians in jazz who knew what they needed to make the music, it's best for the... If there were enough musicians in jazz who knew what they needed to make the music it's best for the audience and for themselves, then what I do would not seem unusual. But what it turns out is that they know so little in general about what they need that when they arrive, we seem like prima donnas. I think that that's great. Like the fact that we have everything goes off great in our performances and we get great instruments. It's not luck. It's because we put in these demands. And you're not actually going to be able to make those demands if you don't know what to ask for. Right? Where he says a lot of musicians, if there were enough musicians who knew what they needed to make the music its best for the audience and for themselves, there's like this insinuation that they don't know what they're talking about. Like they know how to play, but they don't know what makes the piano perfect. They don't know how to tune the piano for the acoustics of the venue that they're playing at. So they're just going to take the piano that's on stage. And so you need to have an understanding of all those things. You need to understand the tools and in this case, your instruments and what the venue's acoustics are like so that you know what to ask for. In our second deep dive on James Cameron, we talked about a very similar lesson where it's like James Cameron can't sit down, like they're making Avatar right now, Avatar 3, or any of the avatars where this applies to. Like James Cameron can't sit down at a computer and do all the like programming and design work to make the CG of the movie come to life. Like he doesn't have the skill set to be able to do this. However, James Cameron has done the work to understand the full capabilities of the technology used to make Avatar, that when he is dealing with the people who are actually doing the hands-on work of the design, of the coding, of the animation of the film, he can communicate with them in a language that makes sense to them. Like he's not asking for things that are not possible. He's asking for things grounded in the reality of what he knows is attainable. And he only knows that because he's done the work to understand the tools. And that's what Keith Jarrett and his band are doing here. They have done the work. They understand what is possible. And they are demanding of that in order to give the best performance they can. It is your responsibility as the artist not to be able to use every single tool at your disposal, but understand not only how they work, but the full capabilities of those tools so that you can communicate the needs that you have in order to get the final product that you're seeking. And when it comes to promoters and Keith Jarrett being difficult to work with, one of the most famous examples of this is Keith Jarrett's greatest commercial album, we'll say, the Cologne concert from 1975. And so Keith, this concert was put on by Vera Brandes, who at the time was 17 years old. She was at the time the youngest concert promoter in Germany's history. And they had organized this performance by Keith, I believe at the Cologne Opera House. And they paid for Keith to have a ticket to fly from wherever he was to Cologne to get the performance. And what he decided to do was to cash in the ticket for cash and then drive to the performance, I believe for like an 8-hour drive with his producer, Manfred Eicher, in the car. So he gets the performance and his back is killing him because Keith has this very physical way of playing the piano. He doesn't just sit down and play. Like when Keith, especially when he's doing his solo work, he doesn't do this as much in the classical sense. He doesn't do it all in a classical sense. But when he's doing jazz, he is up off the bench, he's on the bench, he's moving, he's like arching his back. At times this frustrates a lot of people, but he makes these noises with his mouth when he's performing, which he describes as like this release of tension of playing in the way that he does. Like he has to release in some way, and so he releases audibly, but he's like moving and twisting and contorting while he plays the piano. And so that has led to like a lot of health problems for him physically, like again with bad back and arms and shoulders and all this stuff. And so he drives to the performance for like 8 hours with his producer, and he gets there a few hours before the show, and his like back is killing him. And so I think he goes in as a nap. He comes in, he's checking out the piano when he made his requests for the specific piano, and the wrong piano was delivered to the venue. And so Keith is looking at this piano, and he's like, I am not going to perform on this piano. So you better get me the piano that I want, or I'm not playing. Like it's as simple as that. And so Vera Brandes is like, okay, whatever, go back to the hotel. Eventually she organizes a dinner for them to go to this Italian restaurant. They try to get the piano in, but due to the conditions, like the truck had already left, so they had to find another truck and they were going to try to bring it, but it started raining outside and that would have damage to the piano, made it worse than the piano that they had. So ultimately, getting the piano Keith wanted was not possible. So Keith is unaware of this, like at the time, like he thinks the piano's still coming. Vera's like, hey, we can't get the piano. And Keith was like, okay, well, we're not going to play that. And Vera's like, please, like, and at this point, the the piano had been mic'd up. Like they were planning to record this performance. And Verwick was like, please do this performance. Like it's a sold out crowd. We're not gonna be able to refund anybody, like the 3,000 people coming. And Keith was like, eventually he kind of relents. He's like, you know what, fine, whatever. I'll do this performance. And they were going to tell the sound guys to go away, but they're like, you know what, whatever. Like, we'll just record it. Who cares? It's already here. It's all set up. Like, we'll just record it. He goes to lunch, or he goes to dinner at this Italian restaurant that Vera had organized. And there was like an issue with the service where they didn't get their food for an incredibly long time. And so it was like not long before the performance, Keith finally gets his food. He's able to take like a couple of bites and that's it. And then he's running to the venue to give his performance. And these conditions of a bad piano, a bad back, not really getting to eat beforehand, he's exhausted from his drive. What came out of that is one of the greatest solo piano performances of all time, which feels counter to what you think, right? Like you'd think in order to give a great performance, you'd have to set yourself up in a way that is good for that performance. Like you want to have a full night's sleep. You want to have the best piano possible. And I think part of this thinking comes through like from in our culture today, especially I think in like an athletic context, but you're even starting to see it over in like this personal development space of like, you just want to have the perfect routine. You know, you want to make sure you're getting adequate rest and you have the right tools and all these things. Everything has to be perfect in order for you to be at your best. I think there's a level of credibility here, but I also think that sometimes it's not about what you have, it's what you don't have. And especially in an artistic context. And so a lot of people say what made this performance so great was the fact that the piano was bad. Because Keith, while yes, the piano is bad and he wanted a better piano and now he's not able to play in the same way he's used to playing on this bad piano, he understands his tools like we talked about. And so he knows that, okay, well, he kind of has an idea of how to get the best out of this piano. Like he knows what he can't do, but he also therefore knows what he can do with it. The constraints of this piano forced Keith to play in a way he never would have without it. And that is what made the performance so great. And this kind of relates back to where your weakness is often your greatest strength. Like the weakness of this performance was this piano, but the piano ultimately ended up being the greatest strength because it forced Keith to play in a way he never would have. Uncomfortable situations like this is often where you grow. Because again, you're forced to act in ways you're not used to acting. Like this was not dancing on the edge per se. This is a different kind of discomfort. But because Keith couldn't play the way he's used to, he had to play in a different way. So it broke him out of like a type of habit that he had with his live performances. It forced him to do something he never would have on his own. And that is another advantage to why you should be pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. Another way that the chaos of the Cologne concert improved Keith's performance is because when everything is going wrong, Keith now has to think about everything but the performance itself. And like we talked about, one of the keys to getting into flow is to not be thinking about the music, not be thinking about what you're going to play. You kind of have to be at zero. Like you have to go on there to open yourself up to receive the flow. And so when Keith gets to the concert and his back is hurting and he's tired and the piano's wrong, and he's stressing about all of these things, the last thing he's thinking about is the music and what he's going to play. Like there's this quote of his, you always want to make it as good as it can be. But when you have problems that you can't do anything about one after the other, you start forgetting actually what you're doing until it's time. And that's one of the secrets to improvising. One of the secrets to improvising is working instinctually, like we've been talking about. The key to flow follows action. It does not follow thought. And action without thought is instinct. And so at the Cologne concert, because there's so much going on that Keith is thinking about, he's not even thinking about the music, so by the time he actually sits at the piano, he just goes because he hasn't thought about the music at all. And so when I say, I guess, that like he's breaking this habit of how he plays the piano, it's not necessarily that he's thinking, okay, how do I get the best out of this piano? It's like he just instinctually knows how to play this piano that has these different constraints that a regular piano wouldn't have. It's in giving over to his instincts and letting those instincts work within certain constraints that created this beautiful performance, which Again, like every time I hear the first like few notes of the Cone concert, like I remember the first time I listened to it, like the first few notes play, because all the hype had kind of been building at this point, right? Like as I'm doing the research, like people are talking about the Cone concert, it comes up on occasion. I'm like, okay, this is his biggest record. Like this is the one. And sometimes like your expectations can skew to a negative degree where it's like, okay, like that was good, but like my expectations were way too high. But when I put that record on and you hear like the first couple notes, I was just like, okay, yeah, this is going to be as good as everyone says it's going to be. And it is. It's a phenomenal album. It's on Spotify, of course, so you can listen to it. It's very, very good. But again, this beautiful performance was born out of all of these constraints, out of all of these things that had to be overcome. And so I do this a lot when it comes to my podcast. Like I will stress myself out when, like if I'd gotten a bad sleep last night, or 2 nights ago, I got a bad sleep. And my basketball coach when I was like 16 was like, it's not the sleep the night before, it's the sleep 2 nights before that will impact how you feel that day. And 2 nights ago, I had to drop a relative off at the train station really late. So I didn't get home till like 1:30 in the morning. Obviously, I had to be up for work the next day. So I was like, man, I'm not going to get a great sleep. Like, then I got to record the podcast. Like, how's that going to impact my performance as a host? But then I remembered this lesson of like, you know what, sometimes it's through adversity where our best stuff arises. And I don't necessarily think this is my best stuff, but like it has given me a different perspective to adversity, where adversity oftentimes is where we have to rise to the occasion. You don't have to rise to the occasion when everything is comfortable. And I think that's just an important lesson for you as an artist, which also makes me think of this idea of when it comes to like wanting perfect conditions all the time. And this is me kind of taking a leap a little bit away from working within the constraints. But there's this thing that Tom Schulman said to me, and Tom Schulman is the writer of Dead Poets Society. He won an Oscar for that. He also wrote some other popular movies in the 90s, What About Bob and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And this advice that he got from, I believe it was Milton Kitsalis, who was a screenwriting teacher, told him that like, look, I think he was also like a theater director and stuff, but what Milton said was like, you have to go to work like a grocer. Like no matter how you feel, no matter what the conditions are, like the grocery store always opens at 7:00 every day. Like it doesn't matter how the grocer feels, like the store's opening. And so for you, it doesn't matter how you're feeling as an artist, like you have to go to work as an artist that day. And I think if you're feeling different, if you're in a different conditions, like the Cold concert, like something is going to come out of that you never could have planned for. And that can be a great thing. And so don't let adversity in your creative process be a deterrent. You know, that's advice. I'm like, when I have a bad sleep the night or 2 nights before a podcast, I'm not looking at that as a negative thing anymore. I think this idea of operating on your instincts is really important because your instincts come off the back of preparation, right? Like you have to build your instincts to throw them away, essentially. Like you have to do all of this training. You have to put in the work to achieve a certain level of competency, to achieve mastery. But then when you actually come to make the thing, you have to not think about any of the training with which you've learned. Like it's this really confusing thing where it's like you have to do all the work, and then when it comes time to do the performance, you have to forget about the work you've done. So like Keith puts it, is to play jazz and make something valuable out of it takes a perfect balance of 2 things: mastery and relinquishing control. Like mastery is the foundation of what you've done. Mastery is the learning. You know how to play the instrument, you know how to get the best out of the instrument. Relinquishing control is how you find the new. Because mastery is all that has come before. You're not going to find the new by trying to do what has already been done, but you learn by doing what has already been done. So you learn the instrument by what has come before, but in order to find something new, you have to let go of everything you've learned to get there. You have to relinquish control. And so your prerogative as an artist is the preparation is what prepares you to capture the moment that exists, the magic that exists on the day. Like Frances Fisher told this to me. Frances Fisher is an actor. She was in Titanic. She plays the mom in Titanic. She was in Unforgiven. She played Strawberry Alice. And she said to me, is like, prepare, and then just kind of be. Like you rehearse your lines, and you get on set on the day and you just have to be in the moment and forget about the lines. Like the lines are there, but you're reacting to what's happening in front of you. That's what preparation does. It prepares you to react to the moment. It's not preparing you on how to do the exact thing. As Keith puts it, an artist has to live in a state of constant preparedness. And that preparedness is the state of being that one would call inspiration. So if I were to go to the studio now, I'd be able to play something of great importance anytime. But that is what jazz is about. How can you be ready? And so that is what the work is for. The work is to get you ready. Ready for a moment you could never prepare for. That is how you build your instincts. By doing the work, by doing the practice to get better. Like all of the work you do beforehand is what allows you to seize the moments of inspiration, to seize your lucky breaks. Like that's another James Cameron lesson. Is James Cameron believes in luck, but he believes the hard work is what prepares you to make the most of your lucky breaks. And I just love that framing because it's a difficult thing, right? Where it's like you have to operate on instincts. You want to improvise. You want to not do all these things that you've been taught, but you need to do the things that you were taught in order to be good enough to improvise, in order to be good enough to make the most of your lucky break. And so if you're somebody who's struggling with the fact like you haven't made it yet, that is an opportunity for you to continue to get better. For when the moment you get the opportunity to showcase what you can do, you've done so much work leading up to that point that you can do something great with the limited time you have. All of the work you do, the hours of time you spend working when nobody is watching is what prepares you for the minute they start watching. So while it sucks to not get the attention you think you deserve, I understand that. That work is going to come around and benefit you in some way, shape, or form. But the problem with luck is you can't predict it. So you can't predict how or when it is going to happen. But it is your job as the artist to be ready for when it does. There's kind of an example of this, like specifically this lucky break idea in Keith's career. I mean, obviously there's the like build your instincts, be prepared for the solo concert, right? Like he has to be, all the work he's done allows him to do these complex improvisational solo concerts for 45 minutes straight, twice in a night. But there's also an example of like how these solo concerts really came from a lucky break that Keith got. So at the time Keith was 1971, Keith is touring with Miles Davis. And he has these ideas for these like solo piano records. But the problem is nobody in the States wants to record them. Like they don't think that no one's going to buy these records. There's no value to recording it, so he's not going to do it. But eventually he gets in touch with this guy named Manfred Eicher, who runs this label in Germany called ECM. And Manfred offers Keith the opportunity to come and record an album in his studio. But the problem is Keith is touring with Miles Davis. And so Keith, in between two Miles Davis shows, they had a day off. So he flew, I believe it was to Germany, and recorded this album called Facing You in a single day. And this Facing You solo piano record, because he had to record it so quickly, eventually gave him the idea of doing a solo thing on stage at a festival. And there's a pretty positive response to what he did at the festival. And that then kind of planted the seed, or that was the seed that grew into these live solo concerts, which became what Keith is most known for. It's led to the greatest selling solo jazz and solo piano record, maybe the greatest selling piano record of all time. And that all grew out of a single day in the studio. But the reason that all of that happened, if we go rewind, the reason that Keith was able to make such a great record in the studio in a single day is because of all of the work he'd done leading up to that point. Like all of the work, all of the performances, all of the piano playing he had done. I think he was 26 when he recorded that. In those 23 years, if he started playing when he was 3, is what made him good enough and capable enough of walking into the studio and recording a groundbreaking piano record in a single day. The preparation he did prepared him for the opportunity that was given to him by Manfred Eicher. And Manfred Eicher really was the only person who believed in Keith Jarrett's solo abilities. And they were kind of this they were this perfect match. They were like kindred spirits in the fact that they both cared about the music above anything else. Like they were both incredibly demanding in the studio. Like Keith, of course, had high expectations of himself. He had high expectations of his bandmates, and Manfred would end up recording a bunch of his other music as well, like not just his solo stuff. They became partners basically throughout their entire careers. And there's a story of Manfred on one of Keith's albums called In the Light, where he spent 90 minutes adjusting a microphone by millimeters until it was perfect for the recording. Like he would move it a bit, test it, move it a bit, test it until it was like the exact sound that he was trying to capture, like to, again, like the nth degree. And that was like his norm. Like he had high standards in the studio, as did Keith. And there's this quote in Rolling Stone from 1979. And again, by 1979, like Keith Jarrett has become Keith Jarrett. Like he's reached arguably some of the height of his fame. Together, they make some of the most sterling aesthetic music of the day. If Keith Jarrett has at last arrived, it hasn't been alone. And so him and Manfred Eicher, again, I use the word kindred spirits. Like they are on this mission together. And I think if you can find someone, and I think I know, if you can find someone who not only has the belief in, who believes in you as much as you do, but puts in as much work, who cares about the thing you're doing as much as you do, never let that person go. And Keith and Manfred, again, Keith didn't let Manfred Eicher go. They became, again, close throughout their entire career. And like I said, the music came first. Like the reason American labels didn't make Keith's album was because they looked at it and they went, can we make money with this? And they're like, no, probably not. Okay, well, we're not going to make it then. And I'm like, well, would it make great music? And they were like, yeah, but it doesn't matter because we're not going to make money with it. Versus with Manfred Eicher, it was always like, well, will this lead to great music? Was the first question. And then if it was yes, then okay, let's do that. Because I think the belief was if we can make great music, we will therefore make money. And so you're creating a different incentive structure for the artist. I mean, not necessarily for the artist, but for everyone involved. You're creating this incentive structure, this environment that supports the artist to make the thing that they want to make. And I think that there's, obviously this is the ideal circumstance for any artist, but we also have to be realistic in the fact of like money does exist and money is a big factor in the creation of art. Like business, as much as a lot of artists don't like to talk about it, is what supports art. And so you have to think about the business side of things. And so for Keith and Manfred in their specific situation, like this works so well for them because to produce a Keith Jarrett record was actually relatively affordable. Because Keith could record an album like Facing You. He could record an album in a matter of hours. And he was so talented that it was great music. And it wasn't just Keith alone. Like he could do this with his bands. Like there's a story of him going into the studio with his bands for like a 5-day stretch with the intention of making an album. And they leave the studio with 3 albums. And so for Manfred, like it's a low risk endeavor to work with Keith because he can produce music at such a fast rate that there's not like a lot of upfront costs for Manfred to do this. And so I think that in this environment that Keith and Manfred have created is ideal, but there's also a level of like, it makes business sense to do it as well. But I just love the idea of this was an agreement centered around great music. And it was the great music that led to great finances. And I don't think you get the reverse. And I don't, but I think it's harder in the reverse, where we're focused on making a lot of money, and focusing on making money is not usually what leads to making great art. The focus on the art is important. And I think that sometimes that can get lost when we get so caught up in, especially in today's world where it's like we're caught up in the numbers and you hear terrifying stories of like shows or movies on Netflix are being made where characters have to announce what they're doing all the time and they walk into rooms because you want to make sure that the person who's watching Netflix while on their phone is able to keep up with the story, even if they're not paying attention. Like following the numbers is not the way to doesn't lead to great art. Following the artist does. And that was what the agreement between Manfred Eicher and Keith Jarrett did. And I want to talk about too, actually, a little bit more about this ability, this prolificness that Keith had. Like he released over 100 albums in his career, which really, a lot of them are live albums, which is different, obviously, than like a album made in the studio because it's just an hour and a half. They record the performance and they put it out and that's it. And so it was because of his ability, it was easy to be so prolific. But even in the studio, like I said, he could record an album in a day. Him and his bands could perform albums or could create multiple albums in a week. And part of the reason for that he, and especially him and his bands, could record so much so quickly is because Keith had he was focused on spontaneity, especially spontaneity. I think this is important. Keith prioritized spontaneity over technical mastery. And even part of the way he did, there's a story of him hiding his band's music stands so that they would focus less on the music and more kind of just about being in the moment, getting into flow, being spontaneous. And he even often used to refuse to do a second take of a song. They would do one take and that's it. Even if the band felt like they could do better, Keith wouldn't want to do that. And I think part of the reason for that, one, when you hide the music stands and you're only doing one take, is that forces concentration. Forces concentration on the moment. Like we talked about, concentration can lead to flow, and flow can lead to your best performance where you're channeling something greater. And so Keith would create this environment in the studio for him and his band. And the quote that he says in relation to this isn't his own. It's by Arthur Schnabel, who's an Austrian classical pianist. He's one of the world's most honored Beethoven players. And what Arthur said was, I don't like doing another take just because I played a wrong note. If I do another take, it might be better, but it won't be as good. I'm going to say that again. If I do another take, it might be better, but it won't be as good. And I remember when Keith said this in the interview, he was like, I wish I had said that. And I understand why he feels that way, because that quote is so good. It's not about form. It's about feeling. It's feeling over form. That's what Keith is trying to get at here with the spontaneity. That's what Arthur Schnabel is trying to get at with his quote, is on that first take, when you're channeling something greater, when you're being spontaneous, when you're in flow, you're tapping into these feelings that you have that come out in the music, versus when you go back and start to make changes to the music, right? Like when in Arthur's case, where it's I played a wrong note. If he were to go back and redo it with the intention of playing that note better, the feeling, the essence of the music being captured is going to change, because the intention of the take is different. It's not to play how I'm feeling, it's to make that one thing better. So now he's approaching the music in a different way because he's playing it, but he's focusing because he's trying not to play another note poorly. He wants to play the note he missed correctly. And so it might be more accurate take of the music, but it's not a more emotionally resonant take of the music. And that's what Keith was chasing with the spontaneity of his group, is he wanted them to be in the moment and to capture that moment with music, versus trying to refine a moment and refine a feeling into a more technically perfect way. And when it comes to feeling in his music, he's never going to tell you what that means. There's a quote in the original liner notes from his first album, which was called From Life Between Exit Signs. And he wrote, "I've been asked to say something about the music in this album. I would like very much to do so. However, if there were words to express it, there would be no need for the music. I can speak for Paul, Charlie, and myself on an extra musical level, or a human one. The music is, after all, sincere, so do not question its meaning. What you feel or experience from it is what it is. It's no more and no less than that." And this denial of what the music it means or what it's about is a very common thing. And the first time I came across this was when I was doing some research into Freddie Mercury. And Freddie refused, especially even when asked directly what any of his music means, he refused to tell you what it meant. And the reason for that, what he said, is that if I tell you what the song means to me, that becomes what the song is about for everyone. And so it then eliminates, everyone has their own theories and they've layered their own meaning to his music. And if Freddie tells them what it's about, then it invalidates how they feel about it. You go, oh, that's what the song means? Oh, I thought it meant something else. And so you default to Freddie's take on it because he's the one who made it, but Freddie didn't want to do that. He didn't want to invalidate the feelings of anyone who listened to his music. And so he would never tell you what the songs are about or anything, because he wanted you to make your own personal connections to it and not let those be voided by his own personal feelings towards it. George Miller, not quite the same, but talks about how stories to him are allegorical, meaning like you can add your own meaning to them. They're open to interpretation, essentially. And for example, so one of those is, and George specifically says that, like, or one of my takeaways from studying George is like, your personal opinion about your art is not the truth. It is your subjective opinion about it. But once your art is out into the world, it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the world, who can interpret it in any way that they choose. And so, and by doing that, again, they create a personal connection to it, which deepens their connection to your art. And if you come out and try to tell people that their interpretation of your art is wrong, it ruins their connection to it. And so with George Miller and allegories in this relationship to art, there's a story of he was in South Africa. And this was after he'd made the 1995 movie Babe, where he wrote and produced it. He directed the sequel. But the movie is about a pig that wants to be a sheepdog. And the animals can talk to each other, but the humans can't understand them. And these people came up to George and they were like, when he was in South Africa, they're like, we loved Babe. It was so good. And he's like, oh, thank you so much. And they were like, we loved that you made a movie about the apartheid. And George was like, what? I didn't make, and they were like, well, yeah, like if you look at this scene, there's like one scene where I think it's like either the pig or a dog is herding chickens, but they've herded the chickens into white chickens and brown chickens. Like it's clearly like they picked up on all this symbolism in the movie that they saw as being related to the apartheid. George did not make the movie with the intention of it being a movie about the apartheid, but he also wasn't going to tell those people that they were wrong, because he went, if you can see that it's there, then it's there. Like I can't deny that you see that. And so therefore it must be there. And so how you feel about your work is not the truth. It is your subjective opinion about the work, but everyone else, once your work is in the world, can have that subjective opinion. And so I think it's interesting that Keith here is telling his audience not to question its meaning. What you feel or experience from it is what it is. What you feel is the truth for you. What I feel is the truth for me. But if Keith were to tell you what it's about, if you're questioning what it was Keith trying to say with this music, that's not the purpose of it. The purpose of it is for you to hear it and for you to feel or experience it. And that is what it is. And of course, all of this isn't to say that like your feelings towards your art are invalid. I want to make sure that's very clear. That's not what I'm saying here. I think that both things can be true of how you see the work is correct and how somebody else sees your work is also correct. Because obviously there's going to be a lot of emotions and things that you put into your work. And like the reason the creative process is the processing of emotions. Like there's that famous C.D. Lewis quote, and he's a poet. And he said, we do not write in order to be understood. We write in order to understand. We relate that back to what we were just talking about, where it's like, we're not making poetry. We're not making music so people go, oh, I know exactly how you feel. We're writing poetry. We're making music so that we can share how we feel in a different form with someone who can take it and interpret it against their own lived experience and find something in the art that you personally didn't find because your lived experience is different from theirs. And so I think part of having something to communicate comes out of struggle. Like Keith himself says, you have to want to struggle. And what most leaders, like band leaders, are a victim of is the freedom to not struggle. Because obviously when you become a band leader at a certain degree, like you are probably have enough success where you don't have to struggle. And you also have the people who can carry some of the music for you. And anyways, and he says, when you have the freedom to not struggle, that's the end of that. Forget it. Is you have to choose to struggle. Like struggle is an important part of making art with resonance because there's substance that comes from it. Right. And so I think the type of struggle changes as you go through your career, right? Like the struggles you have when you're on the come up are going to be very different from the struggles that you have once you've made it. Because a lot of the needs you were trying to meet earlier are taken care of. You have a lot more money than you ever thought you'd have. You have a bigger house than you ever thought you'd have. It's like, what do you do now? You have to find other things to struggle in. Like you have struggle of your circumstance, but you have struggle with yourself and your emotions. There's physical struggle. There's struggle with the art itself. And so you have to work through all of these things in your art. And again, this feels kind of like a bit of a contradiction when we just talk about Keith being so spontaneous. It's like, where's the struggle in the art with that? But I think that that's a little bit different, where it's like you have to struggle. Because you don't always have to struggle with the art. That's just one option. And you could argue that his solo concerts is a level of struggle of how do you do this thing live with all this risk happening and these stress and pressure. Like there's a struggle there. But when he's in the studio, it's more so He's done the struggle beforehand with his emotions, with how he's feeling, and that kind of just gets projected out. But there is a struggle happening that's being released through the music. And you, again, have to choose to struggle, because when you get to a point where you are free, you have the freedom to not struggle, it's easy to become comfortable in that and not struggle. And so again, the similar way you have to choose to go out on the edge is choosing to struggle. But that is a necessary thing that artists must do in order to create art with resonance. Because I think when there's genuine struggle going on, you can feel that as an audience, because there's true emotions being put into this thing. And art made from comfort, you're trying to channel emotions into your piece that are not authentic to you in that moment. And so you have to constantly find ways to put yourself into these situations of struggle to make art with resonance. And one thing that Keith felt removed struggle from the process of creating was electric instruments. And he'd been very vocal throughout his entire career of his dislike of electric instruments. And you might be like, wait a second, but Keith Jarrett played in Miles Davis's electric band, which is true. And what Keith says to that is there is only one person on the earth who could have made him play an electric instrument, and that was Miles Davis. And so he did that to play with Miles, not because he wanted to play an electric instrument. And he says that, electric instruments are like toys and they're not serious things. And what he says when it comes to struggle is like when you're making something with an electric machine, whether it be like a synthesizer. He was even asked about like the Apple computer. Is there any like appeal to making music on a computer? He says, where's the struggle involved in composing? Where's the physical involvement in the whole process? It becomes so simple physically, and the result will be parallel to the input. From the beginning of keyboard instruments to the piano, every innovation was based on how much physical input you could make use of. After the piano, less and less and less. Turn volume knobs, push buttons. There's no touch. And if there's no touch, it's synthetic. I think that there's a level of truth in what he's saying, but I don't fully agree at the same time. Because I have heard music that was made, quote unquote, synthetically, that had a deep level of resonance with me. I think there's a lot of validity to what he's saying about the physicality of your playing. Because when you're playing on a piano, if you feel something, if there's like tension there or anger, you can hit the keys harder. And that physicality of how you feel into the performance will be reflected in the sound that is created. Versus when you're making music on a keyboard or something, like that's just a matter of turning a knob. And so there's like, I hear that with the physicality component, but I don't necessarily believe that music made electronically has no resonance. However, so I'm trying to figure how do I agree with, like, I don't think we have to agree on everything. And I think that as I continue to do this show, I'm going to be getting so many differing opinions. I'm not going to agree with everything, but I'm trying to find truth in what Keith is saying, at least where we overlap in some sense. And I think the physicality piece I buy fully, and I don't think there is a exact way to replace that with an electric environment. Like if you're making music on a keyboard, like if you hit the button harder, it's not going to change what the sound is of the actual thing you're making. But I think really what it comes down to for me is like the intention of the decision that you're making. Like, are you able to articulate why you're making the music sound that way? And I think when you get into an electric instruments, you can let those tools do some of the work for you and some of the conveying of the emotion. And so I think where the struggle has to be when you're making music electronically is you have to get so into the nitty-gritty of being able to articulate every single little decision that you made and why you made it in that specific way and what it is you're trying to communicate. I think that would maybe be probably not, because Keith has been staunchly against electronic instruments his entire life. I was going to say maybe that's a point I could make to him that he would agree with, but I also sense like you can't physically express what you want with electronic music in the same way. But then again, you hear somebody like Fred again, who makes beautiful music that's electronic, and it's like, well, I feel so much from what he has put forth into the world. And so I don't buy that it's synthetic. I do think that there is emotion that is being felt, but I understand where there's a bit less of the struggle, but I think it comes down to intentionality in what it is that you're making and not outsourcing creative decisions to the machine. Allow it to enhance your process. Do not allow it to be the process. But one thing about electronic music that I think is interesting, in terms of Keith's opinion on it, is he says that synthesizers and technology like computers and stuff allows anyone to play music, but not anyone can make music. And I think that distinction is really important. Anyone can play music, but not anyone can make music. And I think he's not saying I think he's saying make music that's good is I think what he's saying here. Because I think now he's correct. Like with all of these tools, there is a lower barrier to entry in terms of making music, which I think on one hand is a beautiful thing. I think everybody should have the ability to express themselves in whatever way they deem appropriate. However, the barrier to entry is also diminishing of making something that sounds good. Because you can outsource some of those creative decisions to the machine, you don't have to learn everything. Like it's easier, I guess, when I say lower barrier to entry, it's a lower barrier of entry to start, but it's also a lower barrier of entry to achieve a certain level of competency. But in order to achieve mastery, because you're skipping over some of those early steps to get to a decent level of competency, it makes it, I don't want to say impossible, but achieving mastery is becoming less and less because we can achieve a respectable level of competency with these machines at a quick rate that we don't have the work ethic to put in to become a master at these things. Because you can outsource so much of it to the machines and you can make something decent because of the computer quickly, there's no need for you to learn those foundational things in order to get better and better and better to become master at the craft. And so I think too, in addition to all this, because everybody can make music and there is a lower barrier to entry, but it's again, a barrier of entry of achieving a certain level that's not mastery. Like we have a lot of average. It's making becoming an average, I'll say musician, easier than it was before when you had to learn the piano, you had to learn the guitar. And so as a result now, the market is being flooded with a bunch of quote unquote average, or we'll say normal or standard, whatever word you want to use, music that it's making it harder for the great stuff to push through. Because there's not even necessarily less people achieving mastery, but there's just so much noise around them that it's hard to find the masters. And I could also argue that part of the challenge with electronic music, again, because you can outsource the creative decisions and you can outsource some of that base level stuff to the machine, it makes it harder to find your voice because you can just use the things the computer is recommending. That's again where I think it's important to be able to articulate every single decision that you make. But I think in order to be able to articulate it, you have to have studied some of these foundational things. You can skip making music on a computer. And so I think there's obviously a lot going on here in terms of electronic instruments and their influence on the music industry. But Keith's hard stance has always been that he has been staunchly against electronic music and electronic instruments. That being said, he understands that they're fun to use. He does not deny that, but he views them as a toy, and you can't do anything serious with a toy. Again, I don't fully buy that. I believe you can make great music that can be emotionally resonant with a machine. I do believe that. John Bellion, I mentioned earlier, is one of my favorite artists, makes a lot of his music on a computer, and he uses machines to enhance his process. And I think his music is phenomenal. And so I do think there are, with a lot of technological advancements, there are a lot of positives, there are not a lot of negatives. That is not a black or white situation. I think there's a lot of nuance to the conversation. But I do think that is an interesting idea of the fact that this lower barrier to entry makes it harder makes it easier to reach a certain level of competency that does not lead to mastery. And it is also clouding out the masters that do exist in the world today. And I do think also it can make it harder to find your voice. And finding your voice is something else we could talk about when it comes to Keith Jarrett, because he has some strong opinions about this, specifically the fact that, what is your voice? Up until the late 60s, he said he was playing in ways that kind of sounded like other people. And so he was having a difficult time finding his voice. Like, who am I? How do I play? This kind of sounds like this artist. This kind of sounds like this piano player. And then one day he was about to go on stage, and like the realization just hit him. To find your voice was probably way down on the list of priorities. Rather, once you find your voice, the imperative is to play and not think about that. Think about what your voice is. It was possible to drop that other shit and just say, well, I am who I am when I'm playing. That freed me to do whatever I heard. If a player gets stuck in their own voice, where do they go from there? Nature doesn't say, I've got these materials, I'm only going to use them for one thing. Make sure it's me. Nature says, I'm going to do as many things as I can, and let's see how much there is. And he really started to harp on that nature point later on in his career about the idea of like nature takes these elements and creates so many things with them. But us as human beings, we find our voice and we get stuck in it. And really, I think what your voice is your ego, which is kind of this idea of this comfort zone of like, this is what I am good at, and I know this will work, and this is how I make things, and this is how I work. This is my voice, so I'm going to do that. But for Keith, the idea of finding your voice doesn't really matter. It's if you do identify what that is to not think about it. Because it can become a limiting thing. It's like this label you're applying to yourself. I am, like, for example, we could go back to George Miller again, the director of Mad Max, Fury Road, actually all of the Mad Maxes, and also the director of Babe. That feels kind of random. These like super aggressive action movies, and then this like kids fable. He also directed Happy Feet. He directed Lorenzo's Oil, which is like a medical drama. So he had this very varied career. And if George Miller had success with Mad Max, 1, 2, and 3, and gone, oh, I'm the action movie guy. We never get Babe. We never get Happy Feet, right? Which were both like Oscar-nominated films. I think Happy Feet won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature in 2006. That doesn't exist if George goes, oh, I'm just the action movie guy. Like he found his quote-unquote voice, but he refused to accept that label, and he just followed the art. And that is what Keith is saying here, right? It's, I've got these talents, now let me use these talents to make music, but not I have these talents, but I'm not going to let the talent dictate what I make. I'm going to let the art dictate what I make. It's like when Keith is doing a solo performance, he doesn't get to a point where he goes, oh, this is kind of a type of music I don't like to play. And he like brings it back to like more familiar territory. No, he follows where the music goes. And in George Miller's case, he follows where the stories go. He doesn't try to force what he makes into a box because that is what he is known for. That is the label that has been placed upon him. No, he's going to do what is best for the art. So before you worry about what your voice is, figure what the art is asking you to say, and use these abilities you've developed to say that in the best way possible, not necessarily in the way you want to say it. You have to break your process. Keith describes it as like, we're talking about the creative act, and the creative act continues to demand different things from you as a player. You don't say, I think it would be very creative of me to do this. The act asks you, right? That's where like the art is telling you what it needs. You're not telling the art what it needs. You have to follow what the art is saying. But it's a hard thing to do, right? Especially, again, as you start to have success and you get put into this box and you get put on these labels and people have these expectations of you. It's hard to break down what you're known for to rebuild something new. Like it must have been difficult for George Miller to be like, I'm the action movie guy. I'm going to go make a medical drama. And then I'm going to go make a kid's movie. Like that's not an easy thing to do. That's going out onto the edge and dancing on that edge and trying to give people something new that they didn't know that they wanted from you. But it's so easy to fall into that trap, to become a victim of your own talent. Like right now, what Keith sees is there are people doing one thing and they end up doing one thing very well, and they end up being accepted at doing that, and then they end up realizing that they won't recognize themselves if they do anything else. And the audience won't recognize it either. They end up being victims of their own talents, let's say, a natural talent. But at that point, if they intend to become an artist of some stature, they have to break out of that trap. Because I think, again, an artist is someone who does something, who creates art and puts it into the world because they have something to say. And in order to say that, you have to do things that might not necessarily be in your style or in your voice, because it doesn't communicate what you have to say properly. Versus if you're someone who has a thing and you do it well and you can do it on a consistent basis, that's not an artist, that's a craftsman. Like, you don't actually have anything to say. You're doing this thing not because you're not making decisions because that is what you have to express. You're doing these things because that is what you have always done, what people expect of you. And so you're, again, this impossible task of the artist is to have these things you know you're good at and to forget about them, to do something else, because that is what the art demands. And that is what Keith Jarrett has done his entire career. He refused to become a victim of his talent. At the height of his success as a jazz solo artist, he decided to start interpreting classical piano. And like, to put into context how successful he was at the time, here is a summary of the 1970s of Keith Jarrett's career by his biographer, Ian Carr. By the end of the 1970s, Keith Jarrett had imposed himself indelibly on the artistic consciousness of musicians all over the world. He had steadfastly, in his own words, realized the impossibility of his task and then continued to do it. And he had been merciless with himself in seeking out fundamental new challenges. He had spent almost 2 years with Miles Davis, led one of the most important trios of the decade with Charlie Haden and Paul Motian, and one of the most creative and influential quartets the American group with Dewey Redman added to the trio. His European group's albums not only had substantial sales, but also profoundly influenced the course of contemporary jazz. Jarrett had opened up a whole new territory with his solo piano improvisations and found a vast new audience in the process. He had shown himself to be one of the most gifted improvisers in the whole history of piano and proved that audiences could respond to and be enthralled by a 2-hour concert of completely improvised solo piano music. Such events were unprecedented, and Jarrett rapidly gained a huge international following for his solo concerts. By the end of the decade, it was also obvious that he was one of the very few jazz musicians to be admired and often, but not always, loved by his peers as well as by the general public. In fact, this 10-year period had a creative intensity comparable to that of the painter Vincent van Gogh, whose entire work had been done in the last 10 years of his life, from 1880 to 1890. If Jarrett had stopped in 1980, he still would have been a titan, one of the most creative and influential musicians of all time. His huge body of recorded work a landmark on the jazz scene, or any other scene for that matter. And so that just puts into context the success of the 1970s for Keith, and he was going to walk away from that to do classical interpretation. And like, in terms of what all of this success meant in a commercial sense, the New York Times reported in 1978 that Keith Jarrett's Cologne concert was approaching worldwide sales of 500,000 2-record sets, which is an astonishing figure in the jazz field, where a sale of 25,000 is satisfactory. So that's 20 times the industry standard. And what you can expect from this level of success is that whenever you have one record or one movie or one book that does really, really well, there's an incremental increase on all of your previous work as well. So the back catalog of Keith Jarrett, you could assume, also started to rise because of the immense success of the Cologne concert record. And so Keith had made artistic contributions, he'd made commercial success, he was a critical success. Like, he had done so much in this 10 years. You could argue that this period, the end of the 1970s, was the height of Keith Jarrett's success, and he made the decision that he was going to step away from all of it to go back and start interpreting classical piano. Thank you so much for listening to part 1 of my deep dive into the life and career of Keith Jarrett. If I'm being completely honest with you, I thought this was just going to be one episode, but by the time I'd finished editing it all, it was almost 4 hours long, so I made the decision to split it into 2. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to Artwell so you don't miss part 2 next week. And if you want to get even more out of these deep dives, then make sure you subscribe to the Artwell newsletter. After each deep dive, I'm going to be sending out a letter with all of the lessons that we talked about, written as maxims, these short one-liners to help make them memorable, along with some of my favorite quotes from whoever we're studying. And now, go do your thing. And whatever it is, do it well.